Well, I mean, the TDC and the book fair this year are very much honored to have invited Louis and Joanne to be here. Two very important literary roles in the English-speaking, English-writing world. On this title, right, the novel, The Lure of Distant Places and the Strangeness of Ordinary Life, you know, which sounds a little bit of a, 18th century stuff. I mean, I used to be a student of English literature. I got a degree from Warwick 30 years ago. So I could offer one, perhaps a personal perspective. There are two breeds of English literary stars or writers. One who have or had traveled extensively, especially since the beginning of the 19th century, from Lord Byron, Charles Dickens, Rudyard Kipling, and Lawrence of Arabia, you name it, Graham Greene, and many others. The other category is the writers who had never traveled, like John Bunyan or William Shakespeare, whose traveling experiences had only been limited to that pathetic 100 miles between London and Stratford upon Avon. However, the latter category, the writers of the latter categories had written rather exciting things, things in Denmark, well, if not Scotland, but Venice and a few places in Italy. These people could pretend that they had traveled extensively in Europe, whereas they had not moved a single mile away from the Butlins Hotel in Margate, perhaps. And we are very fortunate to deal with to embrace a very rich and versatile English writing world with so many travelers now taking the advantage of easy traffics, taking aeroplanes, flights to Bali or Bangkok or Phuket or Nepal, anywhere, and then come back with a widened or much broader sense of humor and widened inspiration compared with the rather dry journey of the Christian in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's World. So you guys have taken the advantage of extensive traveling and have brought back to the global readers so many fantastic and marvelous works. And Louis and Joanne, they have traveled to countries ranging from the United States, Germany, to Scandinavia, to Nepal, and Turkey, or Cyprus, or Australia. And neither of them have been to China except Shanghai, right? By Louis, I wonder whether you could call Shanghai a part of China, just like London being a part of Britain anymore, right? So, I mean, that is my rather brief prologue, and I would rather like to leave the most cliche and must be the most boring question to you. How have you benefited from your traveling experiences? And lady first.
Oh, thank you. I must correct you. Thank you very much for your opening. It was brilliant. I have been to China.
Oh,
quite a lot.
Sorry.
So how have I benefited? Well, I think it's interesting you say why travel, and partly as your introduction suggested, it's obviously much easier to travel now, and it's there. And I think when you grow up, as I did, in firstly a very small village in rural England, and then a very small town, you're longing all the time to see something else. You're looking at the horizon and waiting till you can go. And I think that's a very common feeling. And Shakespeare also is fascinated by elsewheres and invented places. And the possibility for change when you go to the shores of Illyria or to these other countries that he invents. And I think it's something about that. It's escaping from the usual, the normal, the ritual, the conventions that you've been given and that seem to restrict you to go to somewhere which is a new reality. You want to find these elsewheres that stimulate and excite you, I think.
So since your childhood, have you been obsessed with certain places in the world, and you felt dying to go, like Tibet or somewhere in Shangri-La or whatever?
Well, I was obsessed with the far north. My first book was about the Shangri-La of the Arctic. It was the same idea. So this Atlantis of the Arctic called Ultima Thule or Thule. And this was the place that people went to and never came back, like the Shangri-La. You know, these explorers disappeared into the misty north and no one knew where they'd gone. And so it was this great myth that lasted for 2,000 years where this place was. And as people finally got to the North Pole, they started to realize in the early 20th century that there was no Shangri-La in the north. They thought there was treasure there. So I was always obsessed with the Arctic as a child, with polar explorers, and sitting in, you know, a very flat, quiet village, thinking about mountains and icebergs and the call of Arctic birds, just for a contrast, I think.
Perhaps that dream of the Arctic world must have constituted the basic tune of some of your rather chilling or colorless scientific world, like the sterilized women's nightmarish land in one of your very famous books, The Birth of Love.
Oh yes, well yes, exactly. In that book, so the first book I should have said is a non-fiction. It's not a novel, The Ice Museum. But that book you're referring to, The Birth of Love. Yes, I had. Well, in that book, the Arctic is a retreat. So they try to. There's a future land where there's this very draconian government which doesn't let women give birth normally. It's all done by machine. And but in that book, some people escape. They want to give birth normally, and they go to the Arctic, in fact, because that's the other thing about these wildernesses. You can sort of do what you like. You can never entirely control a wilderness. It's beyond most people's power to do that.
There's a bit of a reality in China where so many women could not be allowed, are not allowed to give birth to a second child. So, I mean, well, characters in that book, would go to the Arctic for a shelter.
Yes.
And Chinese women would apply for asylum from countries like Canada.
Yes.
And what about Louis de Bernières, right? You were born in Woolwich, right?
I'm sorry about that.
Right? Southern London,
Yeah.
which has been very famous because of the death of the cruel death of a British soldier there. I've been there many times, and I saw the statue of Flash Gordon. This is still there, one of the notorious military traveler in the 19th century who made a trip to China to train the Chinese military, and who died in Khartoum in Sudan.
Yeah. Chinese Gordon. I was born in Woolwich because my father was in the army and there was a military hospital there. So after I was born, I was immediately whisked out to Jordan, where my mother and I had to live in a tent. Then we were sent to Cyprus. So you could say my travels began very young. But the first country I got to know and love, and which is still my favourite country, is France. I went there quite a lot when I was a teenager on exchanges. And I found that after a short time I actually was able to think in French. And thinking in French turned me into a different personality. I think that one of the lovely things about travel is that you can become someone else when you're over there. Then I spent a year in South America, in Colombia, where I was living and working on a ranch, where I had 3 horses, and I was teaching in the mornings, and in the afternoon I was doing cowboy work on the ranch. And the peasants they only wanted to teach me obscenities, so when I came back to England I could speak perfect obscene Castellano. I know all the words for the parts of the body. And but having Colombia, for those most of you probably haven't been there, but back then, I can't say what it's like now, but back then it was extremely violent, but also extremely exuberant. The men dressed like peacocks, with sort of purple shirts and yellow trousers. And however poor they were, they still seemed to enjoy life a great deal. And after that, I came back to university in Manchester. Well, back then, Manchester in England was a very grim industrial town. Everything was broken, most people were unemployed, everything was filthy, it rained all the time, everybody was depressed. And so, in my imagination, I stayed in South America. So, in my 20s and early 30s, I was reading nothing but Latin American literature. My contemporaries were reading Martin Amis. I was reading the great South American writers. And I've got a feeling that we are a bit like computers in that you tend to get out what you put in. And I think that that's the reason that when I first got going as a writer, I wrote 3 Latin American novels, one after the other. I was simply getting out what I had put in.
So, I mean, for your information, Louis is a polyglot, and he's also extremely versatile and erudite. He's also a musician, well versed in quite a number of musical instruments, from guitar, mandolin, all right, and then what? Name it. You name it flute or clarinet.
I had to give up the clarinet. It was interfering with my flute playing.
Right. And you're still playing guitar, you mentioned.
Yes.
And you have a strange obsession or passion for music. How has the love for music been inspiring your literary muse?
In several, actually, extremely direct ways. So, Colombian music is very complex rhythmically. It's very hard for a non-Colombian to reproduce. But they had one instrument they play a lot called the tiple, which I sort of fell in love with lots of tremolo. But when I first went to Greece, I just loved the music coming out of the speakers in the tavernas, and I assumed it was traditional music. And I spoke to one of the waiters about it, and he said, no, it's not traditional, it's composed. It's composed in the Demotic tradition by our best composers, like Theodorakis, Hadjidakis, Sahakos, and so on. And he said, furthermore, the lyrics are written by our best poets. And that was actually how I got into Greek culture. It was the music, then it was the poetry, and then it was everything else. And of course, I ended up setting a novel there. So, that's a very direct way in which sort of music has fed into my literary work.
So it's a big step forward from, say, some people like Gerald Durrell, right? Who wrote My Family and
Other Animals.
And it was based on coffee, his childhood years. Mm-hmm. So, and Joanna, right? I mean, I have always been under the fear, as a novel reader, that novelists in the 21st century must face the crisis, this mental crisis of running out of themes. Yet your themes are still, still fall on such a wide spectrum of matters and topics, and especially the description, the portrayal of a dehumanized futuristic world of sterilization and that sort of things. That echoes, of course, the Orwellian tradition. George Orwell has been to India and Burma, and without his imperial experiences, or paradoxically, he was a liberal, right? And then those days and experiences, their killings and civil wars or whatever, gave him a lot of inspiration. And some of your topics and themes are not very feminine.
Is that good?
Well, why not? We live in a global village, and I don't think muse should be hindered by the barriers of gender.
No. Well, I'm glad you say that. Well, I think you should. I mean, you have to write about what it is that strikes you as compelling and interesting at a given moment. I suppose. I mean, also in terms of genres, that's interesting too, because that was science fiction, and of course, there's a big thing, that writers who don't write science fiction aren't meant to write science fiction, and writers who do write science fiction are meant to only write science fiction. Of course, as soon as people set those things up, it's a bit like someone putting a wall in the garden and saying, you mustn't go over the wall. And of course, you think, if I do anything, I'm going over the wall. So sometimes you do it for sheer perversity. And I suppose otherwise, though, you just write what as Louis said, you read voraciously, you go to weird countries that inspire you, you sit in, as well, I mean, Louis was in Colombia and I was in Greenland or, you know, Spitsbergen or Germany or these other places, and just, I think you then just suddenly get these weird ideas about either entire societies or, I mean, I got very obsessed with this guy, Ignác Semmelweis, who was a
Hungarian hero.
Well, he was a Hungarian living in Austria.
Quartet, right?
Yes, exactly, in that book, The Birth of Love. And he's a sort of outsider who goes to Austria, and this amazing 19th century doctor who realises that germ theory, he understands germ theory before anybody else, really 30 years too soon, and tries to get people to start washing their hands in hospitals so that they stop passing on childbed fever, which is killing mothers at the time. And everybody refuses. They say, what on earth are you talking about? You're mad. Go back to Hungary. And he actually does go mad because he can't believe that people won't just wash their hands, and watches all these women dying. And those sorts of characters, once you read a character like that, you think, I have got to put this man in a novel. I don't really mind what I have to do in order to get him in a novel. He just deserves his own novel.
And Louis has been to Colombia, as you mentioned, is an extremely exuberant cultural world in terms of color. Music and cloths and carnival, you know, dances, whatever. And these colors, you know, are faithfully reflected in some of your novels, you know, like Captain Corelli's Mandolin. Whereas your literary world, you know, shines with the kind of icy coldness of sunshine, long daylight, that kind of thing. So it's strange because the juxtaposition of the color systems, you know, are rather strikingly in contrast, but you know, represented by a male reader and a female. You know? So it's a nice pair of antitheses.
I don't think you should read too much into that. If I had gone to the north before I went to Colombia,
right. Yeah.
and she had gone to Colombia, we could have been just the other way about. You know, but I think. If I can go back to your last question, there was something I wanted to say, which is that travel gives you a new perspective on your own country. People often used to ask me, why have you never written stories or set novels in Britain? And my reaction was, well, it's nothing. It's too dull.
Leave it to Martin Amis.
Well, nothing happens. It's too dull. It's too normal. But then, thanks to a Frenchman, I changed my opinion. I went to a Salon de Livre, a book fair in the south of France, in Pau, and I met a fellow called Jacques, who was an artist, and he said to me, I just adore Great Britain. And I said, why? And he said, because it's so exotic. And I said, and this is where we get to the point about the strangeness of ordinary life. I said, why do you think it's exotic? He said, well, if I go to Belgium or France or Holland, I mean, they just all seem the same. But he said, La Grande-Bretagne, c'est un asile immense. Great Britain is an immense lunatic asylum. And when I thought about it, I realized he was right. It's just I had never noticed, because for me it was normal. I grew up in a village in the south of England where almost everybody, I think, was mad in one way or another. But because we were all mad together, nobody cared, and nobody noticed. You know, I could go on for hours about these strange people, so I won't unless you ask me to. But I have quite extraordinary people, but who ostensibly were normal middle class, or mainly middle class Brits.
Britain is a land of eccentrics. Eccentricity is the very core of British literary spirits, and also because of the lack of sun. Because of the climate there. I mean, for the past 200 years, you know, Byron was driven away from Britain, you know, to look to pursue sunshine and a nice and warm Mediterranean.
But after Byron left, he hardly wrote anything, did he?
Well, that's true, yes.
Well, that's partly because he's dying.
He was busy liberating Greece.
Yes.
Rather pathetically.
Yeah, but Louis does. I mean, you focus on a single village, don't you, and all the madness within a single village, and notwithstanding.
That's right.
It's fascinating just to literally when you hone in, as you say, on the lunacy. Then I think it's a wonderful idea.
Barbara Pym is a writer who's rather good at that. She's not as extreme as me in portraying the madness of the English village, but she was very good at portraying the life of unimportant people in out-of-the-way places. I don't know if you've ever read her.
Yes, I have, and I suppose Garrison Keillor, who's doing that in America, this sort of, you just focus and you just let people reveal their madness without really pointing it out to the reader. If you just look at them for a while, it'll come out.
Yes.
But the Arctic, some could argue, looks more like a land of asylum. You know, if you were acquainted with more penguins, you know, than mankind, you know, and also the long broad daylight nights, you know, in summer, and it's got the highest rate of suicide or something, you know, next to Japan or whatever, you know. So I mean, that kind of drawing, in order to embrace that kind of icy solitude, you have to really enjoy being on your own, don't you?
Yeah, I suppose you do. There's a wonderful novel, actually, a Norwegian novel by Knut Hamsun called Hunger, if any of you haven't read it. And it's literally about that. It's about this one character in Oslo. Yeah. And he says, this is about, you know, the time I spent in Oslo, that strange city that no one leaves until it's made an effect on you. And he just has this one character wandering around Oslo for the entire book. It's an absolutely brilliant novel. It's the sort of beginning of modernism, really, 1890. And this character, he won't conform, so he won't do what he's told to do. He won't write the articles for newspapers that would get him money. He just wants to do his own thing. And obviously in the end, he has to eat his shoes, you know, he starves, he has to sleep in parks, but he keeps persisting. And so it has that, Ibsen did it as well in this play called Brand, about this madman who just sits on a fjord, and he won't leave the fjord, and his family suffers. And so it's got that sort of strand. But in terms of the Englishness, I mean, it's very interesting what Louis is saying about coming back to England, because with my last novel, Come to the Edge, I did that. I went to this English village in the north, and that was an amazing release in a way from always being in an unfamiliar spot, just to go back somewhere where you know the rules, you know what's going on, what should happen. And with that, I just wanted to make everything upside down, so everything that should happen doesn't happen, and people go and live in houses that they don't own. They just decide these houses are empty. We're sick of them being empty. No one ever uses them. We'll go and live in them. And they all go mad and they start rampaging over this valley and sort of creating a new society. And I think if you know the rules, you can really start to shatter them. Whereas if you're in a new country, it's slightly different. You're feeling your way a bit more, I think.
I must say I find the British class system really hard to write about.
Yes.
It's, in a way, it's easier to set a book in Turkey, honestly.
Yes.
But my consolation is that in India, how much worse would it be?
But I read somewhere where you said you feel entitled to set a book anywhere. I thought that was very interesting. You said you have to do the research if you do to sort of back it up.
Yeah, well, the thing about my travels is that they have disclosed stories to me. I'm mainly interested in narrative, so if I find a good story, I then have to do the work to write it. So very often the idea of the story comes first, and then I have to get to know the culture or the country afterwards, which is often a long and difficult process.
I mean, it's strange, because I always wonder how you would decide to choose the cultural and historical background of a certain country. You've written on the end of Ottoman Empire in Turkey, and also what occupied Greece, right? By the life of an Italian military man. And these are all very specific, unique period of modern history. Right?
Yeah, but the thing, if you do get hooked on a story, and it is being hooked, you get obsessed. Joanna probably gets obsessed as well.
Or you take the characters as a priority and set them against a certain period.
Characters come in all sorts of different ways, so it's hard to be precise about how characters... Well, characters do make you do things you didn't expect, because they simply don't do as you ask. They misbehave. You know, your baddie turns out to be quite nice, and things like that. It can be quite distressing. But the point is that if you do get hooked on a story, you then will actually, if you're sufficiently obsessive, which I am, then do the work to find out the background.
So you've done a lot of, you normally do a lot of research.
Yes, I do far too much research. If you can't put it all into the book, because then it becomes an academic treatise of some sort, sociology or history. So you have this rather painful process of working out what to leave out. But I think of it as invisible background. The reader doesn't see it, but you know it's there, and it gives you the confidence to think that you know what you're doing.
But the backgrounds in the novels are extremely exotic, right? Turkey, Colombia, and Greece, right?
And notwithstanding, set in England.
Yes, notwithstanding. Right, yes.
Surrey, yes.
Can't get more exotic than Surrey.
I mean, Britain is notorious about its bias against, well, it's a class society. It's biased towards expats, right? And how are you both viewed by what the mainstream of readers, if there is one still in the UK?
Well, Louis should answer. He's got far
Well,
more
Guardian,
readers than
I'm
I
sure,
have.
the Guardian literary critics must love you.
Well, we both loathe the Guardian.
Rather than the Daily
love it.
Telegraph.
Well, every time they've ever written anything about me, they've cooked it up out of nothing. It's really annoying. So I loathe them. And I'm naturally of quite a liberal disposition, and I really, really don't see the point of reading things that I agree with. So I'd rather read newspapers that are further left or more to the right than I am.
Does that mean you literally read the Daily Mail every day?
No, but I do like the Daily Telegraph a lot. I think the quality of the writing in there is extremely good. And it's the one my parents always had, so there's a sentimental attachment too. But I didn't quite follow your question about expats.
Right. Expats are, well, defined by British who live or choose to go to live in the overseas, especially further away from the Christian cultural land, living in a village in Phuket, so there is quite a community of British and French cafe owners, in the province of Yunnan, in a place called Lijiang. I was once there a couple of years ago. I was shocked at the sight of the river bank, packed up with marijuana smokers, espresso drinkers, who just treat that part of China as something like Tahiti, by Gorga. I'm glad that they find another paradise, in a communist country like that, so remote from a power base, a power center in Beijing. They've got blue skies, palm trees, and blue mountains, things like that.
But we seem to have two different kinds of expat, don't we? There's the kind that, as we used to say, go native. And sort of marry locally and start dressing locally and pick up the local language and almost forget that they're British or French. Yes. And then the other kind who create a little Britain or a little France wherever they go.
The Rupert Brooke version.
Yeah. Yeah.
The corner.
My family were very colonial in the sense that my grandfather and one of his brothers were on the northwest frontier, and then he was planting tea in Ceylon. Their older brothers were both killed in the Boer War. My great aunt's husband died of typhoid in India. And when I look at what it cost my family, the empire, I really think that really can't have been worth it. And not, all these white men going abroad to die of terrible things.
It's like in India, the survival rate in India was appalling, wasn't it? And yet people kept going out there, just for some reason. But it was escape, wasn't it? I mean, with my family, who were kind of very poor, sort of people living on the Welsh coast, half of them anyway.
You were born in Suffolk, right?
I was born in Suffolk, but there was this sort of ancestor family they all ran away to sea. I mean, literally, they were by the coast. The boats went past. They were 14, and they clambered on these boats. And I mean, it was just to get away from. Otherwise, what did you do? I mean, they weren't really going off to, find new continents or, sort of create new dynasties. They just wanted to get the hell out of Wales, which I understand. And then some of them went down with their ships, and some of them became captains. I mean, they had this amazing variety of fortunes, as Louis is saying. I mean, I think the world was where you tried to get away from your horrendous little hometown. Yeah,
one would argue without sailing or traveling, there would have been no spirit of English literature. It could be dated back to the oldest poetry, the Beowulf of the English, the ancient English epics, to ancient Mariner, Robinson Crusoe, the Seven Pillars of Wisdom, D.X. Lawrence, or you name it. But in modern times, you sound rather different from Graham Greene, who was traveling extensively and turned out to be a liberal and a hater of colonialism, imperialism, right? And who was once on the dangerous seen as someone on the dangerous brink of being a member of the British Communist Party. You wouldn't certainly go that far.
I'm not particularly ashamed of the empire.
No.
For example,
Right.
every empire, regardless of what it is, does establish a regional peace. So there was the Pax Romana, then you could say there was the Pax Ottomanica, where the Ottoman Empire established a huge region of peacefulness. And up to a point, I think the Brits did that. For example, we stopped the Zulus eliminating the Bushmen. That's something quite to be reasonably proud of. But my take on it is actually the horrendous cost to ourselves in terms of all my relatives who perished.
Oh, yeah.
That's what I
and
was
they were
saying.
all elite. You were all elite. You look at the names, on what inscribed on the stones, at the Jesus College, in the many colleges in Oxford, those who died in an expedition to Africa or in the First World War.
Well, yes, something like 90% of the casualties in the Boer War, the deaths,
yes.
were from dysentery.
Yes. Had they been alive and given another 20 years, they could have been brilliant novelists, poets, and artists. Right?
Because you wonder what they would have done if they'd stayed at home, of course.
Well, that's exactly. They're faded into horror. But I think there's. We're talking about English literature. I think there is that dual thing. You get people like Philip Larkin, who says all great literature is provincial, and by that he means you just have to focus on what's there. And so we have the strangeness of ordinary life as well. Some poets just focus completely obsessively on what's immediately in front of them, or writers. And, in a way, that obsession of focus, as Louis was saying, is the crucial thing, I think. It doesn't necessarily matter where you are. It's like Bruno Schulz, who, just writes in beautiful detail about daily life, and he's completely ignored in his lifetime. But these stories about tiny things, about, feet or shoes or his dad, anything. I think that has an incredible beauty if you have an interesting perspective on it. So I think a lot of it's about perspective. And as well, when you go to places that are allegedly exotic, you don't necessarily want to see them in the way you've been told to see them. You want to try and find, a way that's particular to you to look at them in.
Have you ever encountered any danger, any stress to your life?
Yes.
Nearly died of typhoid or whatever, or on the brink of being kidnapped by a terrorist or something?
No,
Is this story true? I heard there's a story where you were held at gunpoint at a literary festival. But this won't happen.
Well, fortunately, you've been briefly a soldier.
In Rio. Was it Rio?
Yes. How do you know about that?
Someone told me.
Oh,
Yeah,
I went. It was the British Council again. I went on a British Council trip to Rio de Janeiro with Geoffrey Dyer, who's really good fun, and Paul Bailey, who back then was mainly interested in going to transvestite bars, and
a fleeting passion.
But I think he's become a good Roman Catholic now. After one of the meals, I was at the back of this gaggle of us who were walking back to our hotel, and I was talking to the wife of the British Council man there, and suddenly I was feeling really good. I'd had a wonderful meal, a huge slab of churrasco and lots of red wine. And suddenly this man came up behind me. He was a tall, thin bloke. And he stuck his arm around my shoulder and put a gun in my ribs. And the lady I'd been talking to just carried on talking and walking away. And my Portuguese isn't all that good, but he was saying things like, you're rich and I'm poor, and, you give me your money. And give me your watch. And so, I don't know, you either have an instinct to fight or flight, really, don't you? And what pissed me off more than anything else was that he'd interrupted my conversation. It was just so
rude.
It was just so fucking rude. And so I grabbed him. I got hold of the hand, the arm he had the gun in, and pulled it out. Luckily, I am actually very strong, so I pulled his hand. There was a horrible moment when the gun was going past my thighs, and I thought, oh my God, Brazilian blood transfusions. But the gun didn't go off, And I got him down in the gutter, and at that point I wasn't sure what to do. I think if I'd had the real killer instinct, I would have stamped on his face. But I didn't do anything. And he was just lying there in the gutter with the gun in one hand, just looking up at me. And I said something like, "You better off." And he ran across the road and got on an absolutely tiny bicycle, which must have belonged to a child, and disappeared. And by that time, the rest of these British Council people had realised what was happening. But, I mean, I felt really, really pleased with myself after that.
I love the double emasculation. First, being thrown to the ground, then the bicycle.
Yes.
How much more could you be humiliated?
And I got 2 short stories out of that, because when I went back, since we're getting back to literature, when I went back to the hotel, I told the hotel doorman about it, and he told me a really funny story about a mugging. And I said, "Can I have that?" And he said, "Yes." So when I got home to England, I had 2 mugging stories.
Do you ask before you take people's anecdotes? That's very kind of you.
I always ask it.
Yes,
yes, because people often give me their stories, if you ask. So.
Yeah. What about conversations on buses, though? Is that fair game?
I think that's fair game.
Yeah.
I've done that once. I was on a London bus, and there were 2 old ladies sitting in front of me, and one of them was saying, "Oh, my arm really hurts, oh, my arm." And the woman next to her said, "Well, just be philosophical, dear." And the other one said, "Philosophical? What's that?" And she said, "Well, don't think about it."
You have to say that one. That falls into your lap.
I took that one, yeah.
I once got a whole short story out of my boyfriend went into hospital. He broke his leg. He was hit by a London cab. Instant apocalypse in hospital. Nearly died. 15 sorts of complex fractures, etc. And he was lying like this in the hospital, and it was incredibly boring. I had to sit there all day, And actually, I read the whole of Proust. He was in for so long. I hadn't read Proust at that point, and I read the whole thing sitting by his bedside.
He's pretty desperate.
And I was really desperate, yeah. And then this brilliant family turned up, these Yardies, who were kind of the sort of Jamaican, kind of South London sort of street kind of community, and they turned up, and they were absolutely brilliant. There was one of them was, had sort of had an accident, and at any point there'd be about 25 of his immediate family and relatives around his bed. And I sat there and I just couldn't. Proust, I just chucked Proust out the window. And I listened to these guys and I got the entire cosmogony, like the history of the universe, according to these Yardies. It was absolutely brilliant. In the beginning, there was an egg. There was a massive egg, and it cracked open, and the whole thing, and it went on and on. I got the whole history of time and sort of sat there, writing it slowly down. They were brilliant. So he was forgiven. The boyfriend was forgiven for going out drunk and getting knocked off a bike.
My great-grandmother was knocked down by a taxi in the Haymarket.
Was she right?
She refused to go in an ambulance. She said, "I'd never been in an ambulance in my life, and I'm not starting now." So she got taken to hospital in a taxi. She was in bed for 2 months, and then she said, "I'm going back to the Haymarket."
Was she trying to go to the theatre?
Yeah, she's going to the theatre.
I want to see the play.
She made a point of going back to sort of, challenge the place where she'd nearly been killed.
Yeah.
So, writing, right?
Yes, sorry.
How do you conceive an idea, and then choose or figure out an episode or the structure or the storyline of a work, and then put that in the process of giving birth to it?
Go on.
Well,
some are easy and some are hard, I presume.
I did a talk yesterday, actually, and someone came up at the end and they said, "Do you have any advice for writing?" And I gave this one piece of advice, which I think if it applies generally, it could save people a lot of time and years, and because it took me years to understand it. But of course, these things rarely do apply generally, but sometimes they transfer, and other writers have said the same thing, that there really is a process of gestation. So you get all these ideas, you bring all this stuff in, and then there's this horrible phase which you can't really control, where it's sort of doing its thing. And it is an occult bizarre process that you can't do anything about. And if you try and go in too early and sort of drag it out, the thing just wilts in your hands. It's very frustrating. It just emerges as this sickly invalid that faints, basically, as you try to get it to stand up. And so probably the only thing I now do really fastidiously is I don't drag the invalid from the bed. I really, really wait for them to sort of wake up of their own. And then to carry on with the metaphor, they're completely manic. They then run around the room sort of 50 times and whoop for joy. And that's the bizarre thing. You then write very, very quickly. If you let the thing take its time and you put enough of these influences and things within, then you can write it in weeks. I mean, it's glorious. So I think that is the weird, unconscious process that I think is now true. I don't know if that applies to you.
Exactly the same.
Do you?
Exactly
That's
the
interesting,
same.
Yes.
You often get a good idea and then can't think how to follow it up.
Yes.
So I've got several novellas or novels where I've written the first few chapters, and I'm just going to come back to them later. And the novel which I finished last week, I was thinking about for 20 years.
Really?
Yeah, I was thinking about it for 20 years. Yeah.
Only to put it on the paper recently.
Sorry?
Yeah, for 20 years. Why have you not taken the move earlier?
Well, because as Joanna says, there is a gestation period. The child is born of its own accord when it's ready.
But it takes rather long, to get what that pregnancy.
It doesn't matter because in the interim, I don't know if Esther Freud is a friend of mine. She was Best of Young British for my generation as well. And Esther told me a writer is actually always at work. It doesn't matter whether you're playing golf or shopping or sunbathing or doing the garden. You're always thinking about it. And I also think that you need periods of unconscious gestation. I've often found that when I'm stuck trying to write a particular passage, all I've got to do is sit in my armchair and have a doze for 10 or 15 minutes, and I wake up with the exact way of doing it. So it as Joanna says, you simply can't force it. If you force it, I think you're becoming a journalist.
But you do. I think when Louis' publishers phone up and say, "Where's the novel?" and Louis says it's going to be another 20 years, they probably just go, "That's fine, that's fine." Whereas, obviously, because they presume they've seen that the process works. But there's that sort of thing when you're first starting in your career and you say it's gestating. Your publisher says, "I don't care if it's gestating or not. Get it over to me by next Tuesday." So I think that's the other thing, is kind of having the confidence to just say, "This is actually how I'm going to do it."
Well, I was very lucky because my first 4 novels really had been gestating for a very long time, and I got them done a year, in successive years. They each took a year. And after that, I needed to recharge, and Birds Without Wings came out 10 years after that. So it would have been really awkward if I'd come up with one good first novel and then not being able to follow it quickly. That would have been awkward. But luckily I was spared that situation.
But that does happen, doesn't it? You see those first novels and people have worked, obviously, for 20 years on it. And then they get under all the pressure to bring another novel in immediately, and it's a disaster usually.
I think everybody has at least one novel in them, as they say, and that's usually because you can always think of a way of turning your own life into a novel. But if you mine your own life as a source material, you very, very quickly run out of material. And you get stuck. This has happened to a Canadian writer friend of mine. She rang me up in desperation some years ago and said, "I've used up my life, what can I write now?"
I know, then there's the danger people sort of leave their husbands or kind of, have a sex change or anything just to give themselves new material. You can imagine it.
Traumas do help sometimes.
I know a poet called Polly Clark. I don't know if you come across her. When she split up with her boyfriend and her rabbit died, she was absolutely delighted because she got 25 poems out of it.
I hope most of those are about the split up rather than rabbit. I think you might. I'm not sure how many I could read about the dead rabbit. Yeah.
Well, there's an element of mysticism in it. I mean, I'm a part-time writer.
Absolutely. Exactly.
It's the work of the subconscious world.
Yeah.
It's similar to the experience of being hypnotized. It's a process of self-hypnotization.
Yes.
I mean, many people, I do come across many questions like that. How on earth can you write properly? My answer is open the radar of your subconscious world. And there's an element of truth in the ancient Greek belief. There is a muse somewhere in heaven, if you manage to build up a communication with her by opening your radar, and then she would keep coming back. But if you put down curtains or screens or whatever, and then choose a career like an accountant or solicitor or medical doctors, and you are in a different realm. So being creative, I presume, any creator, whether you're a musician, a music composer, film director, novelist, or even painter, must have that kind of similar experience.
Absolutely.
It is the work of a certain spiritual force somewhere. And then, look, I wonder if you have this experience, you look back and reread the works you wrote 20 or 30 years ago, a work of your juvenilia in your youth. Do you feel a little bit strange, as if they were written by someone else?
I'm sometimes very alarmed, thinking, my God, they were good. I don't think I can do that now. I don't think I could write my first 3 novels now, at my age. But on the other hand, back then I couldn't have written the novel I'm doing now. Yes, the work that you've done. There's a stage after you've finished it where you have quite a strong sense of bereavement, because you've suddenly given up all these friends that you've made, these imaginary friends that you've made. You sort of give them up, and they start to fade away. They stay alive for a while because you go on the book tours and you have to read passages and things, and then they become ghosts.
Yeah.
And you have to wait for the new ghosts to arrive.
Yeah, it's the work of ghosts. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's absolutely true about the radar. I heard an interview with someone called Jez Butterworth, who's an English playwright, and he just had this big hit in Britain called Jerusalem, which is another play about the English countryside and how weird it is, actually. And another one, it's set in a forest, and it's just got all these crazy English eccentrics living in this forest. But and he basically said when it works, it took him 9 years to write that play. And again, he did it several times, and it was hopeless. And he said finally when it came through, it was like plucking words from the air. They were from elsewhere, and I mean, absolutely, it's exactly like that, as you say, that it isn't. It is as if you're divining or channeling something. It's very uncanny.
Yeah.
But you sort of know it when it's working.
Yeah,
that's
you
the
know
thing.
it. Well, this way, I think this partly the meaning of the word media, right? You are just a medium, right?
Yes.
And some magical powers working on you, and then you reincarnate in your pen or in your creative mentality.
Yes.
And then you write out something that might not belong to yourself.
That's why I never really understood Freud, because he was trying to free you from that whole part of it. He said, your unconscious is full of these unfathomable desires. We're going to sort it out and bring it into the daylight, and I'm going to free you from yourself. And you sort of think, well, don't do that. That's where all my ideas are. They're all down there. I don't want them sort of, drawn up and sort of zapped by some treatment. Yeah. So I think you need to leave them.
Like clairvoyant, right?
Yes, yeah.
Palm readers or whatever. So you turn on the radio and then you get switched on to a different world, right? So do you ever encounter writer's block? By all means.
You get writer's block.
Boring question, I'm sure.
I personally don't get writer's block, but I often do get writer's stroppiness, where I just don't feel like doing it. So I'll just go and do something else. I never sit in front of the screen or in front of a blank sheet of paper desperately trying to write something. It just simply doesn't work. You might as well go shopping. So I just wait for the ideas to turn up. There are, as I mentioned before, there are times when you've got a good idea but you don't know how to develop it, and that's when you have to put your first 2 chapters into a box file and think, I'll come back to that in a few years' time. It's particularly the case with poetry. I mean, I write quite a lot of poetry, and I often write very bad ones, but they've got 1 or 2 good things in. So I'll leave them in the box, and then a few years later I'll come back and I'll know how to recycle those good things.
So how do you like the career or the life as writers? I mean, certainly you prefer the life of enjoying a glass of espresso, on an island of Cyprus, and waiting for phone calls from your publisher from London telling you the volume of the royalties of the latest season, instead of having to squeeze yourself into the commuter's underground tube and head for Cannon Street Station every morning at 9:30.
Well, I
working
had,
as a banker or accountant.
I had proper jobs, mostly working class ones, until I was 40. So I still have memories of what real life was like. I do, in a way, live in a sort of Shangri-La, but I'm saved from it by having two very small children. I have them for half the time, and so I'm deeply bogged down in my children, and in that way I can't actually waft away and eat lotus in some distant paradise. I'm very much thinking, well, I've really got to get this done this morning because I've got to get them from school. You know. So I'm afraid I'm not in Cyprus drinking coffee while the rest of the world goes by. I'm helping them with their homework.
But there's an interesting thing that if you look, because the Granta list is, partly why we're here, and it's interesting. There was a piece by a journalist called Boyd Tonkin in The Independent just after it came out. Yeah. And he basically said in all previous years, there's been 4 of these lists. They happen every 10 years. And he says all the previous years, the writers have done really well, they've made a living. And he said, this time, it's not going to happen. So this is the generation where publishing is in such peril, and the money's all going. So he said, this lot, they're going to be lucky. They'll be lucky to get on the island, basically. So that's a quite interesting side about publishing at the moment, that it is in crisis.
He wasn't saying that you weren't talented.
No, he wasn't saying that. He was saying however good they are.
Right.
It's just publishing is so difficult now that it'll be interesting. He was saying it'll be interesting to see if they get the same stability as the other generations, basically. That it's going to be tough. He basically was saying it's going to be tough.
Yeah. But I really don't think that anyone in the arts has the right to expect to earn a living from it.
No, that's...
most actors, for example, have other jobs. I know one who's an odd job man, that's how it's always been. People like me are exceptionally lucky to be able to not to have to do other jobs. But if I had to, I would. So.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Agatha Christie didn't have to either, right?
No, and Shakespeare didn't have to either.
Well, he was a stage manager.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yes.
He did a lot of administrative work by getting all these, bohemian actors and actresses organized, and staged for a performance in the evening.
Yeah.
Well, so little's known about him. He was probably doing nights in Starbucks or the Renaissance equivalent. We just don't know.
Right. And also, how do you feel your livelihood threatened in the age of the internet, when so many books or great works could be downloaded free? Some argue that, certainly it's my point of view, pop music has been dying or is already dead since the invention of karaoke and YouTube, and we live in a world completely depleted of pop music geniuses, like Beatles and Bee Gees, and you name it, they're all gone. You get a couple of Susan Boyles occasionally, but we have no pop music stars, right? Well, since Michael Jackson, perhaps. Books could be downloaded, and newspapers, are crying out for help. The Guardian has to expand to America, to get a new market, out of the brave new world and whatever, What do you think about the future of writing and publishing?
Well, with regard to pop music, it's had one good effect, which is that you can no longer sit at home making studio albums. You won't make a living. It has forced musicians to go back on the road. So if you want to hear good pop music now, it's live. I think that's a good thing. I don't think musicians should be allowed to just sit at home and do studio albums. With regard to writing, it is a big problem because of piracy, and also because of things becoming cheaper and cheaper on the internet. It means that the percentages for the writers are getting lower and lower. The effect it seems to be having mainly is that the people who are already successful will be all right, although a lot poorer. But people who formerly would have been able to make a decent living out of it will not now be able to anymore.
And also by sending out mobile texts, the young generations, the attention span is getting shorter. Have you done any survey of the average, about the average age of your readers is like now, right? Do teenagers, read your books, or they rather go for Twilight and Harry Potter, or they just find long and numerous paragraphs of written language simply boring, or get put off.
I think there's a very good book on this. Jaron Lanier, he was really keen on the whole digital revolution. He was one of the big architects of it over in California. And now he's written this book called You Are Not a Gadget, which is saying really that it was all a terrible mistake, because he's now seen a whole generation of creative artists and musicians and writers just go out of business. And so he's saying there was a terrible error very early on, which was about clicks. He said that initially there was this utopian idea that when someone clicked on something, they clicked on your article, on your words, you would be paid. So it would go back to the person, the creator as well. And that this didn't happen. There was a moment where it could have done, and it didn't. And so you got this open society, this free access, which seemed great at the time, but then, of course, had this detrimental effect on people who were producing the work. And so, I mean, it's not too late. Things still can be done. You can still try and amend it, but this moment in history has passed, so we're now trying to deal with the consequences in smaller ways. But I think you just have to persist, nonetheless.
A lot depends on the cultural context that you're talking about. In this room, there are people of all ages, I should say preponderantly youngish. If you did a similar thing like this in Britain, it would be mainly people who are retired.
Pensioners.
Yeah.
Oh.
But if it wasn't for them, there would be no arts in Britain. They are what keep us going.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. Well, perhaps the Secretary for Education should do something about it.
Well, the tragedy would be if you think that traditionally the arts, apart from Shakespeare, were the domain of the rich. It was only the rich. Byron, these rich people they wrote books, they sort of did their own thing. And then you had this revolution where other people got to do it as well. And it would be a shame if it just went back to it being a sort of funny plaything of the rich again. It doesn't seem very fair. So hopefully it won't.
So now is the time for some live reading. Each of you are kindly invited to select an extract from your works and then do a piece of live reading at the auditorium of a length of preferably not more than 2 minutes, because we will soon be followed by some question time.
You toss for it.
I'll go first, and then because you can finish, you can culminate. We'll culminate in Louis.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I may not be good
it's
at
a good thing,
culminating.
I always wish I always wonder, has Shakespeare in life, which prologues or which monologues he would have chosen? Would that have been Hamlet or anything else? Right?
Sorry, so 2 minutes. Hang on. Right, hold. I'm going to read less than that. I'm just going to read a really short bit. If anyone was at the talk I did yesterday, I'm really sorry. This is what I read yesterday as well. But if you weren't, then I hope you enjoy it. This is from my first novel called Inglorious, and I'm reading it, I think, because we've been talking about ordinary life and also the desire to go away. And this novel is all about a woman called Rosa Lane who reaches her middle 30s, and her life has been very ordinary until then. She's done the right thing. She's got a job and a flat and a nice boyfriend. And then her mother dies, and she basically says to herself, is this really what I want to do? Does it mean anything to me? Is it sort of real to me? Is it serious? And does it give me a sort of advantage point on life that's what I want? And she decides, she answers no. And so she goes on a kind of quest for another sort of way of living, for her own path through life. And all her friends and relatives think she's being incredibly self-indulgent. They all tell her to get a grip and just go back to work. And I called it Inglorious because there's a poem, an English poem, by Thomas Gray, written in an English country churchyard, And he talks about mute, inglorious Miltons, all these graves he's looking at of these people who never had a chance. They could have been Milton, they could have been Shakespeare, but they never had a chance to express themselves, and their words have been lost. And so I thought Rosa was a kind of mute, inglorious Milton. No one was asking her for her version of life, her idea about the meaning of life, but she decided she'd try and find one anyway. So it's a kind of mock heroic quest. But this is the opening where she decides that's it. She began it on an ordinary summer's day when she found, quite in contravention of the orders of her boss, she was idling at the computer, kicking her heels and counting. Rosa Lane, 35 and several months, aware of an invisible stopwatch tolling her down, was counting the years, the hours spent sitting in offices, staring at the sky, at the flickering screen that was sending her blind. She had spent the previous 10 years in a holding position, her legs locked under a table. She had typed 1 million emails and strained her wrists. She was no closer to understanding anything. Ahead she saw the future draped in grey. Behind was the damp squib of her family's history. She was sitting in the present with this past and future whirling around her. And outside, the city was awash with daytime noise, the grind of traffic, blurred speech, elusive choirs. The noise was ebbing and rising again, and she heard the cries of birds in the eaves. She thought of the river moving and the flow of cars, smoke drifting across the shine and colour. Sitting at her desk that day, sweating into her shirt, she thought, if they told me I would never do anything more than this, would I want to live or die on the spot? Then she thought, what is the reason for it all? What is it for? That really cut her up, so she wrote an email to her boss. It was terse and elegiac. It began with her youth, early career, thanked him for his patronage, communicated her deepest regrets, and ended with the words, I resign. She was emphatic. She pressed send, and then she shut down her computer. She picked up her hat and coat and walked. She was having a fit of nerves by the time she passed the guardians of the gate, the 2 fat porters who sat there trading jokes. They sauntered towards her. If they'd spent another second rattling the keys, she would have crumbled and begged them to lock her in forever. Then the gate swung open. Off O'Malley, they chorused and released her. Rosa went out onto the street where the cars were queuing to go forward. Then she went home.
I've once read a collection on the Daily Telegraph website, the most famous opening paragraphs of 100 great novels, in the literary world. I mean, how hard do you struggle to get your first paragraph out? I was told that it's very essential, important to get the first 5 lines out in order to be attractive and make the readers stay.
It is important, but you shouldn't fret, because no one really starts a book with the first line. You write the book and then think of the first line. That's what I do anyway.
I also think you've got to do a bit of full disclosure. If you say the body lay on the floor and then the rest of it is a kind of delicate existential poem, then the reader's just going to be very disappointed that it's not a sort of big thriller. So I think you have to say this is the kind of book it's going to be. You may as well just decide now whether you want to read on.
Okay, your turn.
Okay, I read standing up. Next month, so you can't buy this, I have a collection of poetry out. I've been writing poetry ever since I was 12, and my favourite poet is a Greek Alexandrian called Konstantin Kavafis. I always travel with Kavafis in my pocket, and I inevitably ended up writing poems in his manner. He was interested in the ancient world and in the erotic life and also in philosophizing. I thought the obvious thing to do would be to write a poem that I actually wrote last time I was here in Hong Kong. I'd been reading Kavafis in the plane all the way over, tanking up on red wine. So by the time I got to my hotel room, I was in a strange state of mind. And I wrote this. It's called The Man Who Travelled the World. He travelled the world, restless as rain. There was no continent unexplored, scarcely a city unworthy of days, a night, a week. In all these places he searched for her face, in the streets, in the parks, in the lanes, always pausing to look, listening out for the voice he'd never heard yet always knew he would know. So many lovers, so many encounters, so many years, so many lands. Now he sits by the window, a cat in his lap, an ancient man far from the place of his birth. And inside that loosening frame of bones beats the same heart as the heart that beat in the young boy who knew she was there and set out to travel the world. He thinks of the children he never had, the ordinary things foregone, the perverseness of such an exhausting, such an impossible search, a whole life squandered on dreams. It begins to rain. He puts on his glasses, looks through the window, watches the girls step by, avoiding the puddles, protecting their hair with their magazines. He fondles the ears of the cat, this ancient man far from the place of his birth, still looking, still in fief to the same unsatisfied heart as the heart that beat in the young boy who knew she was there and set off to travel the world.
Thank you. So we've got about 15 minutes to invite audiences from the floor, to raise any questions. Yes, the lady there at the back row. Yeah, on the back row. Yes.
Hi. My question is that somebody said that to travel is to go from somewhere you fit up with to the place where some other people are fed up with. So wouldn't it be better to try to seek freshness within our daily routine life than to go somewhere else? Can we always find meaning by simply going somewhere? Thank you.
Well, I suppose exactly. The problem is you always take yourself. So I mean, it's that sort of paradox. You're running away, but you can't run away from yourself. You're still, the same person wherever you end up. So yes, of course, your vantage point, the way you see things, will always have this bearing. So if you're a fundamentally really miserable person, it won't really help to go to the idyllic island, and sort of recline. I mean, obviously there are these attitudes of mind that can become ritual and repetitive. But I think traveling is a sort of thing if you want to travel, it's an intrinsic quality of your personality. It's something you do it because you presumably want to do it. So I think it would be terrible if people who quite liked staying at home and stroking their cats suddenly felt they had to go to Outer Mongolia. I'd feel very sorry for them. So it's predilection, your own predilection. I think is crucial.
There's a poem in here about exactly that point, oddly enough. Kavafis wrote one as well, called The City, about somebody who thinks he can go away and make a new start. But Kavafis says, no, you can't. You'll take the city with you. you can't travel away and leave yourself behind. But the thing is, as my little voyage to the south of France proved, going away did enable me to see my own country as exotic, and I think that was valuable. I'm saddened that I cannot live everywhere. I've hardly ever been to a place where I wouldn't like to live, apart from the Arab Emirates. But it's sad you can't live everywhere, but that's just a fact of life.
I suppose taking children with you, actually, that forces you out of yourself. I mean, that's the other way to escape from the self at home or away, as you were saying. Because then yourself is sort of split in this care of the child and remembering your earlier selves, and so they're quite a good way of breaking rituals as well. Yeah.
Okay, there are two questions. The first one is, do you have got any inspiration from the dreams? Do you think you got some subconscious in your dreaming when you were writing? Second question is, what do you think about the writers in exile? Do you have any special interest? Any names you can think of, writers in exiles?
You.
First is Kublai Khan by Coleridge, and the second one is Thomas Mann. My choice, and your pick.
Okay.
Dreams.
Oh, yeah,
I write a lot of things as a result of dreams. There are several poems in here which are the result of dreams. Dreams are normally absurd, aren't they? They are magic realists. All sorts of strange things happen. They often don't have a proper ending. But every now and then I have a dream which is a proper story, often quite an interesting one, and quite often set a long time in the past. I've got at least one which is I had about ancient Greece. I had at least two about France. So I do find dreams very useful. And as I say, sometimes if I can't think what to do, I will have a little doze for a quarter of an hour or so.
I once got an entire novel from a dream, but only the first image. The first image was this sort of vaulting building, and I knew from that this was the image for the whole novel. In terms of Writing in Exile, I just read The Corpse Walker by Yao Li Wu, which I thought was totally brilliant, which is a series of interviews with various people he encountered. It's an amazing book.
I just think there's more than one way of being in exile. I think Nabokov was not only not in Russia, but he was writing in English.
Yes.
That's extraordinary kind of exile, isn't it?
Virginia Woolf said, as a woman, I have no country. As a woman, my country is the whole world. And her point was that any woman in Britain at the time was in exile. There was nothing you could do. And I think that applied to the poor, to everyone who wasn't part of the governing elite.
But Joanna, that was rubbish. She had servants.
No, she was rich. I know.
She had servants.
I know, obviously.
God.
That's the problem with Virginia Woolf. She says the right things, but she was like the sort of, posh Trotskyite sort of
I would really like to throttle her if she was still alive.
No, obviously. And she'd say, right, she was a terrible hypocrite, but what she said you can quote as long as you forget what she was doing at the time.
Anyone can write books if they have servants.
Yes, I agree. And she said a woman to write needs £500 a year, which at the time was a massive amount of money. I mean, she meant you have to be rich to write, basically. Anyway, okay, don't listen to Virginia Woolf. Only occasionally. Poor Virginia.
This question is to Mr. de Bernières. Has your agent ever tried to or suggested to you that your name be changed to something more English-like? Marketing-wise, it's for marketing purpose. A French name on the cover of a novel in English language. It sounds to me it's like a translated work. So maybe you can have a choice to change it to be Louis HBP Smart. Yes, it should be part of your last name is Smart. So why did you choose a French name but not Smart, such a smart English?
He was fostered by a French father.
Don't listen to him. It's nice to have a humorist in the audience. My full surname is de Bernières Smart, for which there is a historical reason. I had an ancestor who was a Protestant, a religious refugee from France. He was a Protestant at a time when it was a very bad idea in France, and Louis XIV began to persecute them. So he deserted the French army and went to join the army of William of Orange, and that's how he came to England with the Dutch king. And he fought in Ireland against the Catholics. Oddly enough, his regiment of French Protestants was facing a regiment of French Catholics. But afterwards, the king gave land to his Protestant soldiers from France. And so we initially settled in Northern Ireland, in Lisbon, where our ancestors are still buried in the cathedral. But so there came a point when there were only girls left. We couldn't pass the name on. And a clergyman called Newton Smart married a woman called Charlotte de Bernières. And in those days, it was actually very common for the man to take the wife's name if it was posher than his. So a lot of people don't know this. But anyway, they decided to call themselves de Bernières Smart, which is what we've been ever since about 1850. And when I first started writing, I was teaching in a comprehensive school in South London. And I was Mr. Smart, because, as you know, the English can't pronounce foreign names. And they're not the only ones. So I was just Mr. Smart. Now, when I started writing, I had any number of colleagues in that school who said, right, I'm going to give it up and be a rock musician. And a year later, you'd find they were working in another school, the other side of the borough, having failed. And I thought, when I first got published, I thought, I don't I don't want to be one of these people, you know, who is a conspicuous failure and has to end up back in school. So what I did was I used the Bernières as my writing name, and I carried on using Smart as my everyday name, right? So if I want to keep things simple, I still call myself Mr. Smart. But the other thought I had was that if I call myself de Bernières, which is a legitimate name, it is my name, I will sell a great many more books in France.
Did that work?
And it didn't work.
Any more questions? Yes, the lady there. We've got.
She's over there on the left.
There, yeah.
Hi. This is a writer-related question. I write a lot of stuff, but I can never finish any of it. And I can always visualize it very clearly in my head, the events, but I don't know how to connect the dots. So what sort of advice can you give me about this? Thanks.
Well, it is true that ending things is much harder than beginning them. Are you saying that you just can't think of endings, or do you get stuck halfway through? You get stuck halfway through?
Why don't you write in a smaller form? So think, I will write a short story. So give yourself, in a way, approach it gradually. So you start by thinking, I'm going to write a 4,000-word short story. And you take your idea, and you start with that form. And then you think, next I'll write a novella. And you go up to 15,000, 20,000 words. And so you get yourself finishing things as you go.
Are you trying to write novels?
Yes, sir.
Well, are you good at writing short stories?
I have written several short stories, but whenever I try to write something longer than, say, 4,000 words, I can, visualize certain events that happen, but I can never connect the dots.
Okay, well, two things. If you can write short stories, think of your chapters as short stories, right? A chapter is a unit of narrative, right? It's a short story. So a novel can just be a collection of interlinked short stories. The second point was extremely good, and I've forgotten what it was.
It was.
No. Oh dear.
No, this was the secret.
Yes, it was. It was a fantastically clever secret.
You know that.
Oh yes. The other things. Have you ever been mountaineering?
Does rock climbing count? Then
yes,
no.
It does, sort of. If you go mountaineering, it's incredibly easy to get disheartened because it's just so much hard work and altitude to get through. When you go mountaineering, the advice of experienced mountaineers is always never look up. Don't look up. Just do one step at a time. Look at the next meter in front of you, and that will get you to the top of the mountain. Right? So don't fret about what you're going to be putting in at the end of the novel if you haven't got there yet. Just do the next bit. The other thing is, it doesn't matter a damn what order you write a book in. You can write the last chapter first. You can write the bits you like best first and fill in the boring bits later. Don't feel you have to start at the beginning and work through, in other words. Just do the bits you feel you fancy and then fill in the gaps later.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Definitely. There's lots of scenes you can't face writing them. You just think, oh. So then definitely just remove that. You could also do what Italo Calvino did, which was a complete cheat, but he called it an avant-garde novel, where he wrote an entire novel of first chapters. Because he obviously thought, I just can't face writing the rest of this book, so I'm just going to write the first chapter. And so there were however many first chapters. So you could do that and then say you're redefining the form of the novel.
Should we have trouble selling it?
Probably. Knowing Italo Calvino. Yeah.
Or how about conceiving a novel backward? Think of the end first, and then the clues and foreshadowings, later.
Yeah, I wrote the last chapter of Birds Without Wings first.
Right, did you? So, right.
Thank you very much, both of you.
Good luck.
Thank you.
So, yes, the last question from the gentleman there. Yes.
Do you worry about sales volume when you are writing your novels or your poem? Because when you are so commercially based, maybe will you lose your artist style, or you just work for money? What do you think? Yeah. How do you strike a balance between your art and your realistic world? Yeah.
How much do you think of the market?
Yeah,
Does the
yeah.
market comes first?
Yeah. In my case, I don't at all think of the market, and I've been quite lucky. I think every writer needs a reader, and when I was first starting out, the person who read all of my stuff was my little sister. And if my little sister told me it was a work of genius, I believed her. And I've always thought of my little sister as my reader, and to that extent, she's my only market. Everything I've done has been a terrible risk. It was mad to write a sort of pastiche Latin American magic realist novels, and when they started doing well, it was completely mad to write a novel set in Greece with no magic realism at all. And then it was mad to set well, everything I've done has been mad actually, but it's always seems to have worked out. And I think if I'd had a very sensible marketing plan, I might not have done very well. This collection of poetry is nuts. Who's ever heard of Kavafis? Oh, good.
But I think readers can suss you out if you're. I think whether publishers do or not, readers suss you out if you're sort of faking it to try and get their money. I mean, they can see it has sort of this smack of inauthenticity, and it's this sort of wet, dying creature that you may have got past an editor, but the readers will realise. So there's no point thinking. Also, it probably doesn't work because it doesn't have that conviction to it. So the market turns against you, I would have thought.
Write something you faithfully believe in by yourself, right?
I think there are certain things you can write by formula, but there are formulae for writing detective novels or thrillers and things. I just don't happen to know what they are.
Okay, so thank you very much, Louise and Joanna, and it's been a very fruitful conversation. And thank you for your coming to Hong Kong again this year, and you have added so much to the book fair in Hong Kong this year. And we all wish that you will be our guest sometime in the near future again. So it will be a time for you to bring forward your books for any autographs, right?
Yep.
Thank you very much. Thank you.